How do you feel when it comes time to split the bill in a restaurant? Are you happy to let your partner see the receipts for what you've bought after a shopping trip? How comfortable are you asking for a pay rise at work? Your answers to these questions might be able to tell you something significant about your psychology. They could even reveal something that is harming not only your finances, but your feelings of wellness and happiness as well. Vicky Reynal can help you find out what those things are. She has made the area of financial psychotherapy her specialty, helping clients unlock the emotional issues that can lead to negative financial outcomes in their lives. As well as working as a psychotherapist in private practice and the NHS, Vicky's a regular contributor to the national press and has written a book, Money on Your Mind, about the psychology behind our financial habits. And I'm very pleased to say that Vicky has joined us on the podcast this week to tell us more about it. Vicky, welcome along.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. I mean, first of all, can I ask how you describe the work that you do? How does financial psychotherapy intersect with other kinds of therapy that people might be familiar with?
Well, it's similar to what people consider therapy, but it has a special focus. The people that come to see me come with a presenting problem that is related to money. So they might come because they find they consistently self-sabotage financially, or they're too greedy, or can't enjoy their money without feeling guilty. There's all sorts of issues like money secrets and conflict in families and couples around money. So the presenting difficulty is money, but it's been particularly important to define a space of financial psychotherapy because traditionally people are quite reluctant to bring up the topic of money in therapy. Maybe they don't feel it belongs there. Some people, when they mention it, they're apologetic about it. I don't want to sound superficial. Or there's a great deal of shame that gets attached to money, and so it gets left out. And when you combine that with the fact that therapists haven't traditionally been trained to think about money and in the way that we've been trained to think about everything else, because not enough academic papers have been written on this and it's not part of the training, then you get a dynamic in which it's avoided on both sides. So the therapist also doesn't pick up on it. So it's been important to maybe, shed a light on the topic and create a space that makes it okay to talk about. And as therapists, we have all the right tools to think about the meaning of anything in somebody's life. Why not apply it to the meaning of money and our relationship with it, which can be so complex?
Yeah, and I mentioned in my intro the work you've done. You were a psychotherapist sort of first, if you like, and then this sort of focus on finances has come from that.
My first degree is in psychology and I have a postgraduate in psychotherapy, but sandwiched between the two, I have a master's in business. Right. And so in the MBA, you learn about money and you also learn about behavioral finance, which applies concepts of psychology to understanding how humans behave with money as a group. But as a psychotherapist, we can dig into the individual. What about your particular story has made you so anxious about spending or so excessively generous? And we can really go back into childhood experiences that might not even be related to money that are shaping what you do with money in the present. And so I started practicing full-time as a psychotherapist. And maybe there was something about either people seeing that I had an MBA degree or my, maybe greater comfort in talking about money that maybe a therapist that hasn't done that before, that made people open up about the topic. And the more they opened up, the more I became curious about it. And I started writing about it. And that kind of snowballed into a practice that now is very much focused on that.
I see. And it seems to me that we're all more fluent these days with the language of psychotherapy in all sorts of areas of their life. People are often familiar with looking at their relationship behaviors or even their attitudes to health, to eating, that sort of thing, in a kind of with a psychological framing. Should we all be looking at our money habits in a similar way?
I think it's worthwhile. If we want to be more self-aware, if we want to understand why we do what we do in any area of life, why not apply it to money? In my experience, when people get stuck in money behaviors that they can't change, or with an attitude towards money that is causing them anxiety, stress, guilt, regret, it isn't because they're they're being rational or they don't know what they should be doing, but it's because there's feelings that are getting in the way.
Yeah.
They're creating an emotional block that doesn't allow us to do what we want to do and what we should be doing differently.
Yeah, and I was fascinated to read in the book about, well, you were talking about attachment theory, and that's something that, you know, sort of people will be familiar with, and I was familiar with in terms of the kind of adult relationships that people have and how that might sort of be driven by infant behaviors and learned things. It was fascinating to hear that then through the lens of, say, you know, whether or not you want a joint account with your partner. That was really an interesting kind of focus.
Yes. What I'm saying there is that sometimes we use or misuse money in these dynamics of wanting to keep people far away or bring them close.
Yes.
So, for example, you might see couples in which one person continues to self-sabotage financially. And when you start digging into, well, what's going on there? It's actually because they might gain great relief when the other comes in and rescues them. It reassures that anxious part of them in relationships that always fears being abandoned or rejected, that there's somebody there caring for them, looking after them, and that's why they're self-sabotaging. Or if you take the avoidant attachment style, somebody that in relationships wants to build a distance between them and the other because that's as close as they can get and feel safe in a relationship. Sometimes they use money secrets. They have a secret account somewhere, or they simply insist on separate accounts because merging finances is yet another way in which they feel too much is getting merged and they don't feel safe in that dynamic. So
that's really interesting. I mean, one of the things, we all do it sort of informally at work sometimes. People will ask themselves a question, what would you do if you suddenly had a huge windfall of money, a huge inheritance, or you won the lotto or something? Would you tell people? Would you not? This is all very revealing, isn't it, of how people, or those answers might be driven by their emotional lives, right?
Yeah, that by their emotional lives, by both of their emotional fears unrelated to money, but also some of the things that they attach to money. Let me give you an example. I had one such client that came to therapy and burst out in tears. They told me they were really distressed. They had a £1 million problem. And I thought it was debt they were talking about. And as we started exploring it, it was actually, they had just gained £1 million because one of the companies they had shares in had been bought out. And they were devastated. They said, well, now there's going to be conflict in my relationship because we're going to disagree about how it's going to be spent. It's going to spoil the children. What's going to happen when they find out that we're now suddenly rich? I will have to face envy from my friends and potentially social exclusion when my friends are going, to the local caravan park on holidays, and now I can fly to New York. And so all these money lessons that had been learned, that money is something that spoils, that, makes you greedy, or it generates envy in others, had influenced this man's experience of wealth. And so you see how sometimes what money represents and all the meanings that get attached to it kind of shapes how we respond to it, even in a good scenario.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, how can people recognize patterns in their own money habits? Because presumably we all have them and they might not be a problem. When do you think it starts to come time to kind of pay those things some attention and maybe even seek out help for them?
Well, there's a number of ways in which you can identify a problem. The easiest one is facts. So if you're accumulating debt, then clearly there is something that you need to pay attention to when it comes to your spending. And if sometimes feelings are a clue as well. So if you're always feeling uncomfortable when you spend, or guilty, regret, that could also be a sign. Sometimes it's feedback from other people. It might be, a friend in a joking manner told you one too many times that you're a bit stingy, or comments like that. Feedback from others is a good way to invite some curiosity on our money behavior. But what I find most interesting are the inconsistencies, actually. So if you say, for example, I'm generally quite measured in my generosity, but when it comes to my grandchildren, I just can't hold back. I buy everything.
Yeah.
Well, that invites the question, oh, what's going on there? What about either the relationship? Are you compensating for something in your relationship with them? Or are you trying to remedy something from your past experience?
Right.
Maybe your grandparents never bought you a gift and you want them to have a different experience. So sometimes when we are inconsistent, it also begs the question, what's happening?
And when it's sort of happens with specific people, siblings, these can be very, very charged relationships, right? And so it's no surprise that maybe there's particular dynamics at play.
Yeah. A common one actually is overspending with friends. So all sorts of social anxieties can lead to overspending, and they have to do with what we imagine, how we imagine other people will respond to us, what we expect from others. And so that desire to please or the fear of exclusion might be behind overspending. And so if you notice that, okay, that's my pattern when I'm out with groups, that's when I overspend, then that's already giving you a clue as to why it might be that you can't hold back in this case.
Well, let's move on to some of these examples, because actually, you mentioned overspending there, underspending. Overspending, you can see there's an obvious problem. If you're spending more than beyond your means, that's a problem. But underspending as well can be driven by emotional behaviors. What's behind overspending and underspending?
There's so many different explanations, and in the book I cover a large number of them, just to show the variety of emotional drivers that could be behind. Sometimes we overspend, as we were saying now, to feel included because we're afraid of missing out.
I see.
Or because lifestyle inflation is a common one. So we want to keep up with the Joneses. We want to not feel excluded in that sense. And there's a certain anxiety to keep up with a status that we're inhabiting. In other cases, it can be about a desired magical transformation of the self. So if we feel unlikable, unlovable, we might spend on items or surgeries or clothes that we imagine will make us feel more desirable. So we hope that we'll come out of the changing room, truly changing the way in which others perceive us or in the way in which we feel about ourselves. But, there's examples of people who might overspend. There's one woman that I write about who actually had a history of abandonments in her past. And the thing that she was regularly spending on were luxury bags that she could barely afford to have. And as we started exploring, what is it? What is it about these items? She said to me, well, things stay. They don't leave you. And so what she was getting was this sense of, I can hold on to something here, something of value that is mine. And that was somehow addressing that wound that she had of, repeated disappointment.
That's fascinating. And because very often the way the culture talks about debt, for example, is very unsympathetic, actually, and it's very judging and even shaming of it's never put in those terms of actually there might be something behind it. And what is that?
Well, there's sometimes really painful explanations. And sometimes it's a matter of growing up with parents who never managed their emotions adequately. They always took an action. They always either smoked or drank or spent. And we learned that instead of sitting with feelings and managing them, we need to take action. We become impulsive, we act and we spend. So, I think we really need to think about the person that builds debt and can't get out of it, not just someone who's behaving irresponsibly, but also somebody who might never have been equipped with the right psychological skills to be measured, to, to manage their emotions and not act them out.
And what about the flip side, and underspending? Because, we work here at Fidelity, we work in a business where we're encouraging people to save for the future and to maybe sacrifice some spending now so that they have a better prospects in the future. And there's loads of good sense in that. But people can oversave, they can underspend, and that's not always healthy, right?
That's right, because financial well-being isn't just about, amassing wealth. It's also about having a balanced relationship with money in which we can enjoy the money that we have and we can afford to spend. And I guess culturally, as you say, it's seen as a good thing, to be frugal, and but it can have a very negative impact on one's happiness when they can't enjoy spending. And there's different explanations to it. One very striking example that I always use is of a client who was very wealthy. He made large sums of money, but he couldn't bring himself even to buy himself a coat. He was so miserly in his spending. And when we started digging into the history, there were a lot of factors that explained this difficulty in allowing himself to have good things. So sometimes it's just an aspect of self-denial. We become, I use the term financial anorexia to give an idea of what I mean. We deny ourselves the good things that money can buy. And there's something about that feels satisfying, either because we feel we're triumphing over our needs. So maybe in the past, we were told we were too needy, or maybe we feel there's an internal greed because emotionally we weren't fulfilled. And so instead of feeling that greed, we deny it and we triumph over our need. And in some cases, there's even a background in certain religious teaching or political teachings that tell you that there's pride in deprivation. You should be,
Absolutely,
happy to, give money away and not be too indulgent. And when that's taken too concretely or too far, it can also be why somebody might feel guilty when they spend.
Yeah, as guilt. I mean that. Yeah, I mean I've known people who have been brought up in a certain way to look, to disapprove basically of wealth and of ostentatious spending, and it's held them back because they've seen sort of ambition as a bad thing, and it's held them back.
Yeah, and sometimes a different manifestation of that guilt is a sort of survivor's guilt. So if that person has maybe extrapolated themselves from a background of scarcity and poverty, they might feel guilty enjoying money that their family never had, or friends might still not have. And so there's a sort of, I should punish myself for having something that other people can't have access to. And that's what's stopping them from enjoing it.
Yeah. I mean, what about simply people who just want more money? They want to earn more, they want more things, they just want more, because clearly there's a big difference between people here, because some people strive for that, others really are not bothered about how much money they have. What can account for those kind of differences?
And I do make that distinction between kind of underspending and greed. If you underspending is about a difficulty, spending money to have something good. Greed is more about an incessant accumulation of wealth. It kind of never feels like enough. And if we use the food analogy, if I've called the underspender the financial anorexic, the greed is more like overeating.
Yeah.
It's the person that just can't be filled. There's an inner void, usually linked to an emotional deprivation in childhood that leaves us longing for more. We're always longing for more. Yeah. And that can be expressed through different symbols. For some people, it's food. For other people, it's money. And so you might see them stuck in cycles of overwork, and it might go hand in hand with a difficulty spending. But for them, it's more about everything I spend could be money I saved. And sometimes it's simply, rather than emotional deprivation, it might be the memory of financial deprivation. It might be, a bankruptcy in the family that has left them fearful that this could happen again and this could happen to them too. And even though, they might have moved on and have even MBA degrees and saving pots, it just never feels like enough.
Yeah.
Sometimes I ask, enough for what? And that question opens things up. Sometimes the response you get is, enough to be taken seriously. Sometimes that's what we seek through money. Self-worth and financial worth are linked in our minds. Yes. And so the more we have, the more important we feel, the more we think people will respect us. And sometimes that's because we didn't feel respected enough in the past. One of the people I speak about in the book was the last of a string of siblings, never taken seriously. He could never reach the top of the counter. He can never do the 7 times tables when everybody else could. And that sense of growing up with that frustration had left him really longing to feel differently as an adult, to be taken seriously. And he manifested that through, wanting more and more.
Interesting. One of the things you've written about is money as a device for control in all sorts of ways. And that's something that can play out in particular, I guess, within relationships between partners, often with, quite sort of harmful outcomes. What are the signs that money is being used to control?
So people can be controlling in a range of ways. Sometimes it's very subtle. Even a gift can be controlling when you're trying to impose how you want the other person to be through this gift. So examples are, the mother that brings the meat lasagna to the vegetarian daughter to say, you should be eating meat rather than respecting.
A not so subtle message.
Yes. And it's so those small gestures can already tell you something, can already leave you feeling, rather than grateful, angry and manipulated. So I think there's something about the response to the gift that already gives you a clue as to, there's something unhealthy going on in this. But any sort of behavior like, belittling a partner for their financial choices, or blaming them, saying things like, it's your fault we're in this state, it's because of your spending, or if you don't stop, then I will. Those sorts of statements.
Yeah, and in the book you talk about a sort of the scrutiny that one partner can sort of put on the other one. Maybe if sort of give them money to do some things, but sort of scrutinize anything out beyond that they spend. And
that's a great point. I always say couples should have a conversation about, where do we draw the line between secrecy and privacy and control? It's very fine what makes a dynamic flip between these three things, because sometimes it's a matter of different points of view. So what I think, it's okay to keep private might be different from what you think. But we enter a dynamic of control when we feel our freedom is being limited. Yeah. So we are either being denied access to money or to the potential to earn money, or we're being manipulated into giving more than we would want to give. So you can see this in family dynamics where there's, let's say, a grandchild saying, if you put me on the will, I'll come visit you more, or, that demand for something in return can make it quite controlling.
Okay. Finally, one that I think many listeners are going to be able to relate to. You've kind of mentioned this a bit, but generosity and the lack of generosity, and why some people clearly do find it quite hard to part with money, the stinginess, the sort of tight-fistedness that probably everyone has come across in their lives. You might be like that person. I know plenty of people that are proudly tight-fisted. what drives that, should I say? And you know, one of the things that strikes me as interesting is that you sort of touch on this, but people are often inconsistent. They're not just simply, well, I don't want to give any money away. In other ways, they might be very generous, but you know, when it comes to splitting a bill or sharing money where they might, you know, might interact with certain people, they can really be reluctant to part with money.
Well, that's where I would explore what's going on in that dynamic. If it's a pervasive behavior, you know, they tend to do it with all their friends, for example, then sometimes what you find there's a wound around fairness and sharing.
Yes.
And sometimes it comes from sibling dynamics. That's where we often learn what it means to share and how things can or cannot be fair. And so if that's not addressed or repaired or thought about, then it might manifest in our adult relationships. And so it might really get under our skin if we end up feeling exploited in some way. So sometimes there's an underlying fear of exploitation. Sometimes there's a fear of intimacy, and when we withhold spending. So as we were talking about before, the avoidant attachment might use money to keep a distance. And, you know, we can do that. We were talking about secrets and separate accounts, but we can also do that by spending less on the other than what is expected. And, you know, we're kind of saying, well, I'm not going to give more than what I'm ready to give here. And it's our way of establishing a boundary that feels safe.
Vicky, we have covered an awful lot there, and it's been absolutely fascinating, but I'm afraid that is all the time we have for now. Why don't you tell us briefly about the book, because we're talking on a week when it's going to be released in the US. It's been out in the UK for since May, I think you said. Where can people find it, and what are the areas that you cover in the book?
So people can find it in any major retailer, and paperback is coming out in April as well. And the book goes through all the different money behaviors, some of which we talked about today: overspending, underspending, money secrets, relationships in families, you know, troubles with inheritance and so on, wealth transfer. And it tries to dig into all the possible sources of the money difficulties. And my purpose in writing this book was that people could feel they understood something about themselves and feel a sense of relief as a result.
And I guess it's true. And I think it was a very valuable book to have been written, because, you know, not everyone is going to be able to seek out therapy, right, and pay for that. But actually, there's a lot of the answers there in what you write in the book.
Thank you.
Vicky, thank you so much for coming in to talk with us.
A pleasure.